Hello, Fiveable. Welcome to our live review for today. I'm Allie Thiessen, and today we have a great live review that is going to be more content-based about kind of the historical overview of AP World History up to 1450 CE. So what that's going to entail is we're going to start with period 1, but I'm actually going to go a little bit back into history today, and we're going to be talking also about what I am lovingly referring to as period 0. It sounds very elusive. I think that sounds so fun. So we have a little challenge for you today. If you see it in comments, if you are a student watching today's live stream, take a picture, tag us at Think Fiveable on social media for a chance to be featured. Make sure you get my good angle when you take a picture if I'm in the background. I'm just kidding, but really. Also, please, in the comments, introduce yourself and tell me your name, if you're a student or a teacher, and also let me know where you're watching this from. I am Allie Thiessen. I am an AP World History teacher originally from Omaha, Nebraska. I taught AP World History for the last 6 years, but I'm actually currently in Germany right now where it is 11 p.m., so it's past my bedtime. But it's all for a great cause for sharing and learning world history. So please introduce yourself in comments. Let me know where you're watching from and if you are a student or a teacher. Today's live review is great for both students and teachers. So teachers, if you're in here, welcome. It's going to be a little bit more content-based, but it's also going to help introduce, especially with the changes to AP World History this year, it's going to kind of introduce some of the changes and how to address those changes and some of the new phrasing that College Board is using. But this is a great video if you are a student joining us tonight, because some of you guys may just be starting school. Any of my lucky friends out there start school after Labor Day and you just went back to school? If you just went back and you're already on Fiveable, you are awesome. I'm doing great so far. And so some of this will be like, whoo, I haven't learned any of this at all. If you've been in school for like 3 weeks, like my school has, then you probably have gone through some of this. It was somebody's first day today. I hope it went well for you, Marlene. So if you've been in school for a little while and you're a student, some of this you may have already been taught. So we are going to kind of go through it like an overview. I'm going to touch on some of the key features in what I'm calling period 0, and also some of the more important things that we need to hit on in period 1, which is 1200 to 1450. So thank you all for being with me here today. 4th week into the school year for some. Wow, that seems really early. But it is already September. It's going to go by so fast, you guys. It's just going to fly by. All right, so let's get into it. Just a little bit of an introduction to what we're going to be talking about today. I'm actually going to start with some vocab terms. And I know I hear groans from across the world. I got some friends in Florida watching today. I hear some groans from across the Atlantic about vocab, but the vocab is more about kind of how to use some of the vocabulary that may be kind of thrown out in the units that you may not know what those terms mean. And so I'm going to introduce those terms for you. And then we're going to start with period 0, which is kind of a funny way to say it, but it's everything that was cut from AP World History when it made the new course this year, AP World History Modern. And then we're going to start where the class is technically starting this year, 1200 CE to 1450 CE. We'll have a few kind of review questions strewn throughout as well. So I'm going to need you participating in comments to answer some of those questions, or at least attempt to answer some of those questions. And if you just started school today, you're like, I don't know any content, but that's absolutely fine. And so we'll have some kind of takeaways, things to remember from period 0 and period 1. And yes, I used a Blockbuster. Any students not know what Blockbuster is? I feel like when I make these kinds of jokes, they're like over my students' heads now because they don't get the references. They weren't alive when Blockbuster was a thing. So yes, we're going to be talking about the ruins of an ancient civilization, not Blockbuster, but other ancient civilizations. And then we have some other great live reviews coming soon. There's one later tonight, so if you want to eat dinner, come back. We are going to have a great live stream about teaching the global Middle Ages, and that's really driven for teachers. But then we also have some great student ones as well, like how to take notes. We have one about taking notes tomorrow. We have a study group on the 6th, and then some good practice for both teachers and students about historical developments and processes and annotating primary sources. I also did a live stream yesterday that was kind of an overview of the new changes for AP World History Modern. So check out that playback if you don't know or aren't really aware of the changes that are happening for the course this year. So let's start with a little bit of practice. I got some friends in here in comments, so I'm going to need you guys to see what we can make of this first source. So this actually is a secondary source here. It is a map, obviously. And so when we're looking at a source like this, the first and most obvious thing we need to do is find the title. And so on this one, the title we have to, of course, find there. It says Asian Trade Routes, AD 400. So obviously AD, or what we would call BCE, is in period 0. So this is going to kind of set the stage for us for what we're going to be talking about with period 0. And then we'll actually be connecting a little bit to period 1. So in comments, take a look at this source, and I want you guys in comments to tell me, what is this source describing specifically? So in comments, let's see if you can point that out. What is this source describing specifically? If you're new to AP World, you're going to get used to a lot of maps like this. And so identifying the title, identifying what's in the key also is going to be super duper important. Now, a lot of us aren't really into a lot of course content yet. And so if you don't know, or if your teacher didn't really go over period 0, this may kind of be new for you guys as well. So what it shows is Asian trade routes. And we can really see 2 different types of trade routes. We see trade routes that are going over land, and we see trade routes that are going overseas. And then if we look into the key here, we can see the different types of trade products that are produced. And as you guys can see, a lot of these trade products, things like ivory, metal, precious stones, silk, spices, these are what we would call luxury goods. So even though we have some other goods like grains being traded as well, but we're really looking here at a lot of long distance trade that's about luxury goods. Now, the other thing that we can point out on this map, if we look beyond the trade routes, as it says in the title, and we see the red line showing us these trade routes, it's also showing us something political. So in comments, participate with me here in comments, what is this map showing us that is political, that's about the government? And here we're actually looking beyond the source title, beyond the trade routes. And here, if you guys can tell, there are some different shading into these different areas of the world that we're focused on here. And if you guys can see where just right there in the center of the image, you can see the Gupta Empire. We can also see it's highlighted in this kind of red color. China, we have Arabia, we have Persia, we have all of these different, and as we can tell by the shading, large scale states and empires. So now we can kind of put these things together. We have large scale states and empires, and we have connections between them by trade. And we see the types of goods that are going back and forth between these different areas of the world. Yep, even into Africa with Axum, all the way into the Mediterranean. We see these kinds of large-scale states, and we know that they're trading with each other. So let's try to read into it a little bit more. So we have these trade routes, we have these large-scale empires, but what else can be connected across these trade routes beyond just trade goods? What other connections can happen besides trading one particular good for another? So when we're trading, we don't just trade goods for other goods. We're also connecting societies that are quite different from each other. And when we connect societies that are quite different from each other, we also get transmission of information. And information is not like a trade good. It's not like, I'm going to trade you this word for this religion. Nice little trade we got going there. As people trade and as merchants go and connect to these different areas, good, they're bringing their ideas with them. And we're seeing the spreading of things like religion. We're seeing the spreading of other types of ideologies. We're seeing also the spread of things like language. And these things are so important in the development and creation of cultures. And even though we're all the way back in AD or BCE 400, we also see the development of these really strong cultures and social hierarchies, but they're also influencing each other. And that's something really important that this map doesn't show, but we can read into, because as people trade, they bring their ideas and they bring their beliefs and they bring their social norms with them into contacting new areas. And so we see a lot more of global connectivity between various regions of the world. So this map, even though it just says Asian trade routes, we can also read into it. Now, here's the thing. I could be showing you a trade map of a totally different time period, but we can also read into very similar things that are kind of continuities across history. And that's why period 0, where we're going to start, is so important, because the trends historically are going to be very similar across history. History does have a tendency to repeat itself. And so we see very similar trends, even in similar areas across all of human history. So let's kind of go over a little bit of what we're going to be talking about today. So today our focus is world history to 1450. Now, how world history modern, the new class is kind of divided up, is that it starts circa 1200 CE and goes to 1450 CE. But that's just 250 years of world history, and it kind of just drops us right into 1200 CE. If we were a time traveler, or anybody a Doctor Who fan, perhaps, we get in our TARDIS and we put in that we're going to the year 1200 CE. We're just dropped into the year 1200 CE. We show up in our phone box and we're looking around. Obviously, people, cultures, empires, states, religions have already been around. They're not just showing up when we show up into history. And so we're going to have to know how to set the stage a little bit. That's another reference, Donald, that I don't think we're going to get here with Back to the Future with some of our students who weren't born yet, and that movie came out. So we're going to start with period 0, what I'm going to call the lost years of world history, everything that was kind of cut from the AP World History Modern, and we don't quite know exactly what's going down the pipeline with AP World History Ancient. That may come up in the future, but right now it's obviously not in existence. So we're going to address period 0, the years that were cut from the course, because it really does set the stage and set the standard for interactions and for empire building, where we're going to really start in the year 1200. And then we're going to get into the meat of it, where AP College Board thinks that history is going to start with this dawn of the modern era, starting in 1200 CE up to 1450 CE. And in honor of this, If you are an AP reader, I have some AP reader friends that are in here. I'm wearing my AP reader shirt from a couple years ago where it has the Mongols on the back. You really can't see because I can't turn around all the way. But I'm wearing my Mongol shirt in honor of the new period 1. We thought that they were going to cut the Mongols from the class, but they just moved history back a little bit so we could save the Mongols. So that's where we're going to go through. We're going to go through each of these time periods kind of independently, and then we're going to make some connections between them. But before we really get into some history, let's start with some terminology. And this is where I know my students really struggle, is they'll read a word and it's in their book and they feel like they should know, where they're like, I think I kind of get this term, but I don't really know it. And so I wanted to kind of go over some terms that are really thrown out in the textbook, maybe in your notes or in class, that maybe you're a little too afraid to ask. And so these are terms that are kind of introduced in this time period as well. Some of them may have been introduced in the earlier time period, but if your class didn't cover it, this is a good way to start. So the first word is diffusion. And so when I think of the diffusion, I think of like my diffuser, which I plugged in right next to me, and it's going out into the air and it's spreading out. So that's a way to kind of visually think about the word diffusion. Is to diffuse, is to spread out. And when we think about diffusion, like let's think about that map that we just saw a few slides back. When we were talking about how ideas and beliefs and language spreads, it really is diffusing. So anything can diffuse from one group to another. Technologies can diffuse, ideas, language can diffuse. And so if we were using this in a context sentence, you could say something like Buddhism diffused from South Asia to China. So it's starting in one area and it's spreading to another. And that's going to be a really important term for where we're starting in world history with this period 1, is because a lot of these ideas, technologies are going to be diffusing from their areas of origin to new areas because of new contexts and new contacts through trade. The next one, because a lot of the focus on period 1, unit 2 is about networks of exchange, you're going to be seeing the word commerce a lot. And a lot of times students, when they see the word commercial, they think of like TV commercials, like advertising. But really, when you think of commercial, I want you to think of commerce. And commerce is another word for trade. So we're talking about the exchange of goods or commodities. What we're going to start seeing into this time period 1 is we're going to be seeing a lot more trade that's done in hard specie or currency. But we also see a lot of exchange of goods for other goods. So all of that is just commerce. It's trade. So we talk about commerce being done in currency or hard money, or we could talk about how we see kind of a commercial revolution because new people are trading in new areas and we have demand for goods. The next one is empire, another word that we're like, oh, I know what an empire is, right? Because we hear it all the time. But an empire is a government that rules over foreign peoples and territories. So when one state is just existing in its own territory, and when they go out and expand and they take over other lands, and they conquer and rule other peoples that are foreign to them, and they bring their rule into those areas, it now is an empire. And so empires have already been in influence from period 0, but we're going to be dropped into these new like land-based empires is how they're going to describe them into period 1 and 2. And so knowing what an empire is just a really good starting point. And finally, we have these two terms. I'm going to go back a little bit, inter and intra-regional. So if you've ever driven on an interstate, what does that mean in comments? If you didn't see what I accidentally showed on the screen. If you've driven on an interstate, what does that mean if it's interstate? Anybody know? Who's got starting some new 16-year-olds out on the road? If you're driving on the interstate, you're going in between two different states. And fun fact, Hawaii has an interstate, but they're an island. So inter means that you're driving between two. So inter is between two different areas. Good. And then intra, what do you think that would mean? If inter is between two different ones, what do you think intra would mean? Intra is going to be within. So inter-regional is going to be between two different regions, and intra-regional is going to be within the same region. So when we're talking about things like trade, especially, we're going to be talking about inter-regional trade and intra-regional trade. I remember a bunch of years ago, one of the long essay questions had the term interregional, and I remember my kids, like, I thought I taught them that, but I guess I really didn't drive it home as much, because my students came back from the AP test and they said, what does interregional mean? And I was like, oh shoot. It's one of those things that we just think we know, but if we don't learn it, maybe we don't exactly know what it means. So when we're talking about interregional trade on that last map, we had trade that was going between China and India. So two different regions of the world trading, that's interregional. But there's also trade within China. And so that would be intra-regional. All right, now that we got some terms in there, there's a ton of other terms. And if you have questions, please feel free to put them into comments. Let me know if you have any questions or any other terms that maybe you've heard before but would like me to kind of help you with. Feel free to ask in the questions and comments. All right, now that we got some terms, let's start back in history. We're going back to the future, except it's back to the past. We're going back to period 0, these lost years, the ones that were cut from AP World History. So this is everything before circa 1200, everything that was cut from the AP World History class modern that for this year. And so the big ones, of course, are the two time periods that we used to have in AP World History. Period 1, foundations to 600 BCE. And then what we used to call period 2, the classical period 600 BC to 600 CE. And then a little bit of our old, what we called period 3, which was post-classical 600 to 1450. So they've kind of split that a little bit. So we have a little bit of that post-classical starting in 1200. How much of the AP exam is going to be over period 0? 0%. But that doesn't mean it's not important. If we understand period 0, it's going to give us a great starting point for context. That's going to be a word that you guys are going to learn a ton this year, and because it's on the AP rubrics, is contextualization, being able to kind of set the stage of the time period. And one way that we can do contextualization is by addressing what happened before. Well, if we just jump into our TARDIS and go to the year 1200 and we don't know anything of what happened before 1200, we really can't connect anything for contextualization to prior to the year 1200. Also, if we start with period 0, it's going to get us a good starting point for global history. And as you're going to see when I talk about period 1, unit 1, it's just kind of a little hodgepodgey, starting in the year 1200 to 1450, kind of dibble-dabbling everywhere in the world. And so having a greater understanding, a greater foundation of history in those various areas around the world is also going to help us truly have a global history, world history class. It also, learning period 0, gives us a good foundation for where we get to in 1200, where we came from and where we're going, and how we see a lot of continuities across those areas and some changes. So I'm going to go through a little bit of content now about period 0. And this one is the one where I think we really need to get a good understanding of, because this may be if your teacher started just at 1200, which is absolutely fine. This live stream is going to be so great to help you really set the stage for context. How I'm going to go through each of these time periods, period 0 and period 1, is I'm going to go by them with the themes. And this year for AP World History Modern, we have 6 themes. And we have social, cultural, economic, governance, environment, and the sixth one, the brand new one this year, is technology and innovation. So I'm going to address them by theme, which I think is kind of the easy delineation, rather because in an hour, there's no way I can teach all of period 0. I used to teach what used to be the old period 1 in like 2 weeks. So that's not gonna happen. So going over this a little bit by theme, I think is going to be a good way to start. So let's start with humans and the environment. This is a great starting point for connecting it to later time periods. Because when we first start in our foundations period, we're talking about the creation of settled societies. And how we get those settled societies, people living in one area and putting down roots, is from the Neolithic Revolution. We have this kind of new Stone Age, new tools, and settled agriculture. And that, of course, is going to dictate how humans interact with their environment and how the environment has really set the stage for human development. And this is also another theme that I think is kind of a difficult one for students, because when we learn about history, it just feels so separate to learn about with the environment, but it's so integral, because our earliest societies that are settled societies with settled agriculture has to do with the environment that they exist. Most of those early settled societies are going to be along river valleys. Those early river valley civilizations, the waters and the fresh water is going to help create the conditions necessary for settled agriculture. So now that people have mastered their environment, they can now live in one place. By living in one place, they begin to put down roots, figuratively and literally. They're literally putting down roots into the ground. They're cultivating the earth. They're becoming pastoralists, meaning that they're going to start to have livestock in those areas. And it's going to create a population expansion. More population, more people also puts more strain on the environment. Hello, that's going to be something that's definitely true throughout history. Bigger populations put bigger strains on the environment because people's got to eat. And so this, again, just sets the stage for later civilizations and later empires. It's the same thing throughout history. More people mean more food. We need to survive as a society. And from there, we're also putting down some figurative roots. We're starting to create a culture. And with larger populations, we have greater social stratification. We have accumulation of wealth. And so this is a great place to start to understand where we're going in history, to know where we've been. So as these societies grow, they're literally growing into early villages, and then increased populations are going to grow into early cities. Those early cities are going to form early city-states. Those early city-states become early empires. Well, as we get larger with more people, we're going to start to develop very complex cultural systems. We're going to start to develop more elaborate belief systems. And we're going to start to see the foundation of world religions. And guess what? If you start in 1200 and you're supposed to know the development of the Dar al-Islam, well, guess what? Islam is pre-1200. And so understanding these religions, where they were founded and how they were founded and spread, is going to be a really important theme to carry on with you into period 1. So understanding how religions and where they develop and how those religions influence those societies and the empires, and the interconnectedness between religions and their government systems is a great foundational step to know. And so we're also going to see a very important feature in world history, the development of writing. Great. Now, as historians, we can go back and we can start to understand how people lived and what they did for work, and all of their complex governance systems and their belief systems, because they're writing and they're keeping records. And that's something that is so paramount to the development of cultures. And as I kind of mentioned before, governments aren't just kind of isolated. Governments also interact with the society at large, and the society at large influences what types of governments that they have. So where we start to see these early river valley civilizations, and they get more complex the greater the population is. Well, now we have a bunch of people living in one area. We need a stronger government to keep us safe. We need a stronger government that is going to be able to give protection to our lands from other areas that want our goods and our resources. And so we start to get some very complex systems of governments. So we go from these kinds of villages to these larger cities, to city-states, to our earliest empires. And understanding how those come about is really also setting the stage for later empires, some of which are going to be in these exact same areas. And how they govern is also going to be pretty similar throughout history. These early like Mesopotamian kings and Egyptian pharaohs, and some of them are going to be almost like divine right rulers. Well, that's going to be something super important to know once we get to period 1 as well. It's not brand new in 1200 or where we pick up anywhere in history. It's something that's been a process and a practice throughout history. Another very important feature is their economic systems. As these communities grow and develop their skills in different areas, they are going to also start manufacturing different types of goods. And our early trade communities are going to be founded on these luxury goods. And that's why we started with that source all the way back in those early slides from this video. So we start to see these governments in different regions of the world beginning to experience inter-regional trade. We kind of start with intra-regional trade. We start with our neighboring towns and villages and our neighboring city-states to trade. And then as we get more complex in our transportation systems, as we have greater needs, as societies, as we have greater wealth for these different types of luxury goods, we're going to start trading further afield. And that's where that inter-regional trade is going to come about. Trade that's existing between these early empires across larger distances. In addition, with the greater populations, we're going to see greater social stratification. And we talk about stratification, we're talking about like a hierarchy. I always kind of think of it as like a triangle with like a smaller population at the top that has more power, more wealth. And as you get down to the bottom of the triangle where it's more broad, and that's where the most of the population is, and they're kind of down the pedestals, and less wealth, less power as we go down the pyramid. Well, as we have more people in these early cities and early villages, we're also going to start accumulating more wealth. And we're going to start seeing things like material wealth. And we're going to start to see class divisions. And these class divisions, as archaeologists and historians look back, we can see them in like the division of how people live, where their houses are. And so a good example of social stratification in a society, if we look at Egypt, which is, part of this huge fertile area along the Nile River, we're going to start to see more social hierarchy because we're going to see pharaohs at the top. And as the pharaohs are kind of like pseudo gods, and we're also going to see the role of priests also being very high up in the social stratification. As our government becomes more advanced, we also need people, government workers, bureaucrats that are going to record history. And those people that record history are scribes, and they have a very important skill, and it can move them up the social ladder. And then as we get further down, we see things like merchants, people that are tradesmen. Further down, we can have things like farmers. And at the bottom, of course, we have like slaves. And so that's kind of an example of a social stratification in Egypt. And we're going to see these social stratifications become more advanced in different societies. In India, for example, we're going to start to see with Hinduism the development of the caste system, which is a very rigid type of social hierarchy where there is no movement between classes. Like you can't learn a skill and move up or earn more wealth and move up in that social class. We have very rigid classes in India, and that's kind of tied back also to our cultural developments. And it's tied back to economics. All of these things are so intertwined. And so it's also important to know these themes and how they kind of cross in between each other. And finally, our new theme is, of course, the technology and innovation. So we start to see these new technologies that are emerging. And with these new technologies, of course, starting with the Neolithic period, it's new Stone Age. We're starting to see new tools and technologies. And these new tools and technologies help us to do things we're already doing better and easier. So we're going to start to see things like metal tools. We're going to start to see iron metallurgy. We're going to start to see even later societies develop things like chariots. As our populations grow, we're going to even start moving further away from the original sources of the fresh water. We're going to start to develop things like irrigation channels. So now let's talk a little bit about the classical period. This is the one that if you know a little bit about history coming in, you probably know a little bit about things like Rome or Greece. And you're like, where is that in AP World History Modern? It's in the Acts. It's part of now period 0. So we start with our foundations, our early societies. Most of them developed along fresh waterways and river valley systems. And these foundations paved the way for the classical time period, where we're going to see continuous interconnection between humans and the environment. But now that we get later into period 0, we're starting to see more global connectivity. And as people are now trading and interacting from even further around, we also see the spread of epidemic diseases. Well, guess what? When we get to period 1, of course, we're going to be learning about the plague. And so this is something that also happened in the classical period. And if you didn't know that, you couldn't bring that context later. Also, as our societies grow into larger empires, we're going to have even greater cultural development and interactions. We start to see religion spread more and from even further afield. We see the development of new religions like Christianity, and where those are going to spread, they're going to influence the people and their societies. And where they influence societies, they're obviously going to influence the empires that they interact with. We also see the diffusion of things like art and architecture, technology between these areas. Governance in the classical period is much, much larger. We're going to see the development of really large empires. We're going to start to see empires that connect and go across tons of different foreign people. How do they govern those? How do they expand? We have new military technology that allows them to expand. This is something that's going to be super important when we get to period 1 and we're dropped into 1200 and these empires have already existed. Like you're going to drop in, here's Islamic Caliphates. Well, what are they? Where did they come about? They came about in this kind of late post-classical period, spreading across the Middle East and into North Africa. And yes, we're going to have some great live reviews also that's going to go over some of these key features. Economic systems, larger scale trading in the classical period. That's where we kind of looked at that first map. We're going to start to see the emergence of the Silk Roads. We're going to start to see the emergence of Indian Ocean trade. So I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit. I don't want to forget anything about period 1 where we're getting into. And also social stratification. As we encounter new groups and people, they have to fit into the social hierarchy too. So where are they going to fit in there? Are we going to take on new ideas from the new areas that we're coming into contact with? How are those new foreign people integrating into our society, or how are we forcing them to integrate into our new society? And finally, technology and innovation. Especially when we get into period 1, this is something that I think is super important for continuity, is especially trade systems in like the Indian Ocean. When we just jump into 1200, it's important to know that new technologies that were developed in this classical and post-classical era are going to greatly influence trade and technologies into our new time period. Things like the lateen sails, that are these triangular sails that you can see pictured on my slide, were used in the Indian Ocean. But guess what? They're going to be modified by Europeans in their caravel sails. And using these technologies and diffusing from one area to another, and like with the spread of things like gunpowder, is going to dramatically influence these other areas around the world way later than when they were developed and from a far different region. All right, so that's all we're going to do for period 0. Let's do a little bit of practice. And so if you're in here with me on live, feel free to comment as well. So we have 2 images here this time. We have one image that's on our right-hand side and one that's on our left-hand side. And they look at first glance to be very, very similar. So take a look at these maps, and I want you to try to tell me what is the main difference between these 2 maps. So if you're here in comments, let me know what you think is the main difference between these 2 maps. So here we got one map. It says the Silk Roads, and we see this kind of purple color in the Han Empire, this kind of purple color over here. And then we see the red, which is representing the Roman Empire. We have some major trading cities that are in there. We also see 2 different types of trade. We see the trade over land, and we see the trade over oceans as well. Kind of similar to that map that we looked the first time. But yeah, you guys are pointing out some great things in the second map. We see new empires, so obviously we have a change in time period. We're actually looking between the differences of period 0 and period 1, but guess what? They're both the Silk Road. And so we see that under the Mongols, they have created a much larger land-based empire across Eurasia. And because of that, we're going to start to see even larger networks of trade. Also, you guys are pointing out some great things on here. We're seeing more places connected to this trade. So these kinds of red lines of these overland trade routes, now they're going all the way up through Northern Europe. And yes, pointing out some great things. Of course, the Indian Ocean trade is so much larger as well. Well, how did it get so much larger? We don't have like an empire over the water. But one thing that's going to contribute to that is new technologies. And so in looking at comparing the Silk Roads from our period 0 to what's going to be our new period 1, you're going to see a lot of similarities as well. So we already pointed out the difference. Can you guys point out now some similarities between these 2 maps and try to think about beyond just, oh, they're over the same area of Africa, Europe, and Asia? What are some other similarities between these 2 maps? We're still seeing the trade concentrated in the same areas. We still see a lot of interregional trade connecting China to Europe. And so we're both going to see this connection going from China all the way to Europe. Also, what's important is we're seeing some of the exact same trading centers. If you guys can see, I know it's a little bit blurry if you're looking here, like Alexandria, which is such a key component and a trade link between the Indian Ocean through the Mediterranean. So yeah, you guys are picking up some great things. Some of these cities are going to be the exact same. And one thing that this map doesn't show is we're still seeing trade with intermediaries or middlemen. And then, like what we talked about before, is when people trade these goods, they're also bringing about ideas, they're exchanging belief systems, and they're also exchanging things like diseases. And absolutely, these travelers, these middlemen, are taking these same paths. And because they are avoiding things like deserts, high mountains, and creating these kinds of trade roads and that are much safer to travel on. All right, now these two maps, why I was showing you both of these is to understand the importance of not really just starting in 1200. If we just start with the Mongols, we would know how similar it was to trade that was going on pre-1200. And so just keep that in mind when you're learning things starting at period 1, that there may be a good connection to something that had already happened in history, and to make those connections is such a good practice with contextualization. All right, let's get into period 1, where College Board is telling us that the modern world is going to begin 1200 to 1450. This is going to cover 2 new units for world history. They're going to use some new kinds of terms, Unit 1 and Unit 2. They're going to call Unit 1 the Global Tapestry, which I also would name the Global Hodgepodge. And then Unit 2 is networks of exchange. And of course, that's exactly what we were just looking at there, like things like trade. And then this actually is on the AP test. So Unit 1 and Unit 2, Unit 1 is between 8 to 10% of the AP exam content, and Unit 2 from period 1 is going to be another 8 to 10. So together, they're about 16 to 20% of the total exam weighting. So in Unit 1, we are going to have 7 specific topics. And as you guys kind of look at these, they're a little bit all over the place. It's like a world tour around the world in 7 steps. And it kind of vague says developments. Developments in East Asia. Well, what are those developments? We're going to be talking about this a little bit. State building is another one that's a huge focus here, is these growing empires. And then we also have comparison, kind of connecting between these different hodgepodgey areas of the world. So again, we're going to look at this Unit 1 through some themes. So first theme, cultural development and interaction. As we pop into 1200, it's so important to understand that these religions have already developed. Christianity is already developed and not just spread through the Mediterranean, but has been widely accepted in the Mediterranean, and now is an integral part of, especially in Western Europe, of the development of really kind of empires and social stratification. And in the Middle East, of course, we've already seen the development and spread of Islam. Well, that's going to be important as well for empires, because with these Islamic caliphates, they have spread the religion of Islam throughout the Middle East, even into Western Europe as they conquered Spain. And so as we see the spread of these beliefs, they're being used in various ways. And these religious beliefs are having huge influence on the government. And in turn, the government is influencing these religions in society. We're going to start to see the spread of a lot more conversions, some of which by force, of course, which is going to spread even into later time periods. And as well as not just religions, but ideologies like Confucianism, which is totally integral into Chinese culture, into how people relate to each other and how they relate to their government and how they their government rules. With these new empires that are growing across the world, they're going to create and maintain huge empires. But we're also going to see the decline of large empires as well in this time period. So you're going to be looking at how empires grew and spread, like the Mongols, and how did they get across these areas? And then once they conquer, how do they rule across these areas? And for how long? And then why do they decline? These are all important features to understand across all of these areas where it says developments and state building, to understand that a lot of the time we can even point back to period 0, going back to looking at Han China or Rome or Persia even. Overextension of empires is one of the key reasons why some empires fall in decline. And environmental factors also are reasons why these empires decline as well. So connecting back also to period zero, we can see very similar features into how those period zero empires spread and decline, and then into period one. Economic systems, trade networks, that's what we're looking at just then about the Silk Roads. Of course, the Silk Roads and Indian Ocean trade networks are going to increase the amount of trade. Well, now that we have new trade, we also have demand for trade, and that's going to impact also what we produce as societies. Those areas that weren't so much into those interconnected trade, well, how do they get what they need to survive? What kind of labor systems do they have? And socially, how were they organized? Well, we still see those social hierarchies and those stratified systems. And the caste system in India, like I mentioned before, very rigid. And because of more inter-regional trade in like Mesoamerica, we're going to start to see the development of things like guilds, which also is similar in like Northern Europe. And of course, technology and innovation. With the technologies that are developed, we start to see even greater connectivity in the developments in technology with being used in society. And so we have intellectual developments, particularly in the Muslim world, things like mathematics and medicine. Those things are, of course, going to influence other areas as those ideas spread into other regions of the world. Now, a little bit of practice for what we could see for something coming out of Unit 1, Period 1. And here is a short answer question. And this one, I'm not actually expecting you to be able to answer A, B, and C, because we're just kind of going over an overview of Period 1. And if you didn't learn about previously, and you're just starting the school year, you probably won't have any ability to answer a lot of this. So let's look at the excerpt here. So we have an image, and it has the source background. It says, this is from Rumi, who was a 13th century poet, jurist, theologian, and Sufi mystic, who is one of the most influential writers in Muslim history. As a Sufi, he embraced the use of music, poetry, and dance as a means of reaching God. And then we have a part of this image here is a quote. Come, come again, whoever you are, come. Heathen, fire worshiper, or idolatrous, come. Come even if you broke your penitence 100 times. Ours is the portal of hope. Come as you are. And so if you don't know anything about the foundation of Islam, or you don't know what Sufism is, it would be very, very hard to answer this type of question if you were just dropped into 1200 to 1450. And so being able to kind of practice with these kinds of questions that force you to know a little bit about Islam, forces you to go back a little bit to that period zero. So I want you guys to answer in comments if you're in here with me. We're not going to answer A, B, and C. You can go back and try to do that another time because it is kind of a hard one. So I want you guys to answer in comments, why do you think it's important to understand Islam to be able to answer this question? Why do you think you need to go back and learn Islam to be able to answer this question? So in comments, let me know what you think. Without really learning anything about Islam, you're going to have to know when we start in 1200, it's talking about the Dar al-Islam, which is the community of believers. Well, you probably want to have a good understanding of how did that community come about? How did Islam spread to different people? To answer A, absolutely. You have to understand that Islam is a missionary religion. It spread from its point of origin and gained converts as the empire spread, as more like an effective empire. And knowing the beliefs, you're going to have to understand why people would choose to convert to Islam? Why would they choose? I mean, the quote there is saying that it offers hope. Well, what hope is it offering? So being able to understand the quote, you'll have to know a little bit about Islam. Absolutely. If you look at part B, where it's talking about I'm using calligraphy, in part C, using calligraphy rather than imagery, and where it even mentions idolatrous, using idols, understanding about Islam and understanding their anti-image of the prophet, idolatry, not using image-based art. Absolutely. You guys are totally on it in here. And you would have to understand that in order to understand why calligraphy, as you guys can see here in this image of the Sufi, why that would be used instead of icons. And so being able to know a little bit about religion, predating even the creation of the Dar al-Islam, jumping in at 1200, would help you be able to connect to how it spread and what new areas that it's spread to. So you guys are doing great. Good work. All right, let's go on to Unit 2, Networks of Exchange. I feel like we've talked about this one several times throughout this unit and throughout this live review as I keep showing pictures of the Silk Roads. And so this is a great way of kind of connecting all of this together to round out our live review today. So Unit 2 has 7 units or 7 topics within it, and it's about networks of exchange. So obviously our focus here is about trade routes. And as people trade, of course, as we mentioned before, knowing from period 0, they're not just bringing goods to trade, they're also bringing ideas, they're bringing diseases, they're bringing people, and people have different ideas and beliefs that are going to spread as well. So it's going to kind of hit on different networks of exchange like the Silk Roads, Indian Ocean trade routes, Trans-Saharan trade routes. And then, of course, it also is going to connect empires, culture, and environment into this. So some of our themes, of course, one of which is one of the topics, humans and the environment. One of the big ones, of course, is that we're spreading new foods into new areas that is going to cause a population boom. And the one my students always remember is the champa rice in China coming from Vietnam, creating a huge population surge. Bananas into Africa. And this diffusion of crops contributes to larger populations, which larger populations put a bigger strain on the environment. But of course, what everyone remembers with the Silk Roads and the Mongols is not only did we just trade goods across the Silk Road, we also brought the bubonic plague, the Black Death. Woot. Not a good thing, but it's about my shirt. And then, of course, as people are trading, they're also interacting with each other across these trade routes. And as we have these huge global networks of trade, like the Trans-Saharan trade routes, we're connecting people from like West Africa to North Africa, and then by way of the Mediterranean to Europe. And so all of these connections are going to create new interactions between cultures. And as we connect, we're going to start to see ideas from other areas, and we're going to want to adopt those ideas. And so we're going to start to see the adoption of these technologies like gunpowder, and we're going to start to see new ideas in the intellectual world like Arabic numerals in Egypt, religions that are going to spread further afield into new areas. These all are because of the networks of exchange. And then, of course, governance. We looked at that map just a few minutes ago with that comparison. We see these huge empires that are growing, and some that are going to grow very rich from trade, like the Kingdom of Mali in West Africa, growing great wealth from the salt trade across the Trans-Saharan trade routes. And these new governments also getting these new cultural interactions, some of which are going to convert to new religions. Like Mali is going to see conversions to Islam because of their connections by trade to those North African Muslim traders. And so just by way of connection, we're seeing more interactions culturally. Of course, economics have a lot to do with networks of exchange because we are trading, we're dealing with commerce. So we're seeing new commercial practices. That's where that term, why we introduced it earlier. New practices in trade. new things like currency, paper currency. First developed in China, we're going to start to see the use of what we call hard specie. We're going to start to use things like gold and silver to conduct our trade in. So rather than just barter economies, one good for another good, we're going to start to use paper currency. Well, now as we're starting to use paper currency or hard specie like gold, we can accumulate wealth now in gold, and that can contribute to the growth of your empire as well, having a lot of gold. And technology and innovation. And this one is something I said was important because as we're exchanging ideas, we're exchanging new technologies that are going to have a huge, did I say that loudly enough? Huge impact on even period 2. Because as we're getting new technologies, even things like transportation technologies, it's going to put us on a trajectory to continue to improve upon those transportation technologies. So what we may not think was like a technology, a camel saddle, think of it as like a connecting all the way beyond to from camel saddle to new types of transportation technologies all the way to the car. And so these things just continue to go on that human pace to larger and more complex with new technologies and new innovations. And we're starting to see things like iron and steel development in China. I mentioned before, like lateen sails that were used to conduct trade across the Indian Ocean being used by Europeans and adapting them into their caravels, and which is going to help them spread their empires across even the Atlantic. And so all of these things, I know this was kind of fast going through this whole overview. If I was teaching this in my class, I would take about 4 weeks to do all of period 0 and all of period 1, and I did it under an hour. So I know this was a little bit over your head, but please feel free to go back and you can watch this on replay as well. And let's end with some questions. I'm hoping my answers don't show up on there. Okay, let's do multiple choice. This question, I think, is one that's kind of an entryway one if you don't know much about history, but just from our lesson today, I think we can answer A, B, and C. So we can answer 1, 2, and 3, our 3 questions on here. So let's look at the map first. The map says, it's kind of small, we can see the dots. That's all we really need here. It says the pattern of urbanization, the primate first and secondary cities, 650 to 1500. So yay, we're connecting period 0 to period 1. So question 1, answer in comments. What best explains the location of cities in the map? Not above, next to us. Is it A, proximity to the equator, B, location along major trade routes, C, the spread of Islam, or D, China's voyages of exploration? What do you think best explains the locations of the cities in that map? Answer A, B, C, or D. Answer here is B. It is the location along major trade routes. And we got a sneak peek because we already saw some maps about this, kind of gave us the answer. So pat on your back if you got it right. Question 1 is B. Question 2, one likely result, another word for result is effect, of the urbanization pattern shown is A, East Africa remained mired in poverty. B, Europe and Russia remain largely rural. C, Islamic control of the Indian Ocean trade, or D, Chinese dominance of the Strait of Malacca. What is an effect or result of the urbanization patterns? Answer in comments A, B, C, or D. For question 2, what is an effect? Not a cause, an effect. This one is a tough one. I can see a lot of people probably thinking C may be there, but that's kind of more of a cause. The one that's an effect here is B for question 2. Europe and Russia remain largely rural. You can see we have no urban centers there in Europe, none at all that we're showing, and then none that are in what is going to be modern Russia. And so that is more of the effect. Islamic control of the Indian Ocean trade is more of a cause. I know that one's a hard one too. And the last one, number 3, judging from the location of the city shown, the most important trade of the area was based on what? A, the Silk Road, B, the Persian Gulf, C, the South China Sea, or D, access to the Indian Ocean. Based on the location of the cities on the map, the most important trade of the era was based on what? It's a hard one. Don't just look at the big dots. Look also at the small dots. Maybe that'll help. The answer for number 3 is actually D, access to the Indian Ocean. Again, don't just look at the big dots, look at also all of these small dots that are connecting here across the Indian Ocean, East Africa, through the Arabian Peninsula, down to Southeast Asia, and all throughout India, Persia, China, Thailand, etc. All right, so that is some just good practice for you guys connecting what we've learned today. All right, some takeaways. We've reached the end of our lesson overview today. Sorry, went a little bit longer than the 1 hour, but just important to remember that context is everything for period 0. Don't ignore it just because that's where the College Board is telling us to time travel starting at 1200. Understanding period 0 is going to help you so much understand where we come from to understand where we're going. Period 1, we can kind of consider the start of what is known as the modern world, and it is going to help continue to set the stage for the time periods that are going to come after. But here's the big takeaway. Chill, relax. You don't need to know everything, especially about period 0. Just understanding kind of a good overview from period 0 is going to give you such a good heads up as you get into our later time periods. And it's still so early in the school year, guys. So just keep things in stride, keep continuing to learn and grow. And here at Fiveable, we're going to continue to help you on your path to getting that 5 on the AP exam. So that's all I have for us tonight. Don't forget to follow us on our social media platforms. Don't forget we had that little challenge at the beginning to take a picture of you during this live stream and tag us at Think Fiveable on our social media channels, Twitter, Instagram. You can also follow us on YouTube. You can follow me on Twitter at Mrs. Thiessen. It is way past my bedtime now, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your day from wherever it is you are watching us from. We'll see you guys later. Take care.